Dobar dan, drago mi je da vas vidim da ste sa nama danas ovde. Između ostalog govorimo danas o medijima, civilnom društvu, a sada u nastavku, kao što vidite, na redu je online informativna sesija o Zakonu o digitalnim uslugama i Zakonu o slobodama medija u Evropskoj uniji. I online ćemo imati priliku da čujemo gospodina Audriusa Perkauskasa i Julijana Rinhofa, koji nam se javljaju iz Brisela, iz Generalnog direktorata za komunikacije, kao što možete da vidite. Prvo ćemo čuti nešto o Zakonu o slobodi medija, potom će biti prilike da postavljate pitanja, a onda ćemo se baviti i Zakonom o digitalnim uslugama i također će biti prilike za vas iz publike da postavite pitanje. Ja ću se sada njima obratiti na engleskom kako bi mogli da nas čuju, da nam se pridruže, budući da oni nemaju prevod. Mr. Audrius and Mr. Rinhof, hi, nice to see you. I hope we will see you in a few minutes or hear you. Okay, here with us is Mr. Audrius Perkauskas. Hello, welcome to EU Opportunity Week here in Belgrade. My name is Vanja Đurić and I will help you with this online session. I'm not sure if you see me, but I'm here. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can absolutely hear you.
Okay. I told to the audience that you will present us European Media Freedom Act, and after that they will have a chance to ask you some questions. Okay. So the floor
Yes,
is...
with pleasure.
Okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to join your series of events to present the policies and law of European Union in different areas. And I will talk a little bit about European Union media policy and regulation, and primarily about the European Media Freedom Act. But let me just give you a little bit of context and a little bit of introduction to regulation of media in the European Union. So perhaps the most important thing to say about media regulation in the European Union is that we try not to over-regulate. We try to put in place rules only when they are really needed. So this is why, if you look at the history of EU media regulation, it started from audiovisual media, from TV, television, because it was considered that television has greater impact on viewers. So this is why some rules are necessary. So this is one reason. And another reason was that European Union is always promoting and strengthening its internal market. So to make it easier for TV channels to travel across Europe, also some rules, especially the country of origin principle, was put in place. So what I'm talking about now is Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which is in place in Europe already for many years. In recent years, we worked on the second leg, the second pillar of media regulation in Europe, which is European Media Freedom Act. And immediately I have to say one thing, that contrary to Audiovisual Media Services Directive, European Media Freedom Act is about different types of media, so not only TV or video on demand services, but also press publications and radio, for example. And then coming back to what I said at the very beginning, that we don't want to over-regulate media, one important feature of European Media Freedom Act is that, in fact, it doesn't really regulate media. You will see later. What it does, its main objective is to help media to function in an independent manner and to remove obstacles to the functioning of media. So let me tell you a bit how we came to this new regulation, European Media Freedom Act. So it all started from identifying issues across Europe. We saw that more and more there are instances of interference with media, and sometimes for political reasons, but sometimes also for economic reasons, because sometimes political powers and governments, they have a tendency also to protect a little bit more media service providers that are based in their territories against competition coming from other countries. So this is an example of, you could say, economic interference and an obstacle to the functioning of the internal market. So these are the two main problems that we wanted to address. And of course, both political interference and economic interference, it can take different shapes and be exercised in different ways. So, for example, it might be that, for example, in certain cases, the concentration in the market is prevented, which would be economically beneficial. Or it might be, for example, that state advertising is directed more to certain providers and less to other providers, which are perhaps more critical of the government. So we detected different issues like that, in particular as part of our rule of law report. In Serbia, I think you might be already familiar with the rule of law report because this year the rule of law report started covering your country too. And then I will not dwell a lot on procedures. This is a quick timeline how it went. So perhaps just to point that the origins of the European Media Freedom Act can be found in the State of the Union speech, so speech of the President of the Commission in 2021. So you can see that it has taken approximately 3 years to complete the process. And this is considered in Europe quite a fast pace for such pan-European rules as European Media Freedom Act. And below you also see that in principle most of the provisions of European Media Freedom Act will start applying in August of 25, in August of next year. And for certain provisions there are different dates of the start of application. And this is probably the main slide for today, is which shows the structure of the European Media Freedom Act. So it has several components, several main components. One is about rights of media service providers, another is about regulatory cooperation, so cooperation between media regulators. Then we have provisions on how media services function in the digital environment. So, for example, relations between media services and very large online platforms. Then there are provisions on how media markets are regulated. So, in particular, how in Europe we should go about media market concentrations. And then there are provisions about transparent and fair allocation of economic resources. So here you will find, for example, some rules governing distribution of state advertising to media service providers. And so we have rules, and we have the body which will help ensure effective application of those rules, which is European Board for Media Services. So, in principle, it's a new body, European Board for Media Services, but it will be built on the basis of the existing body, which is European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services. And this group of regulators is composed of media regulators coming from all the member states. So the idea is that this group, while becoming European Board for Media Services, will be strengthened, and will get not only more tasks, but also more resources. It will have a stronger secretariat and a greater role in the European media environment. Now, let me focus on some parts of European Media Freedom Act. I will not spend equal time on all the chapters of the European Media Freedom Act because perhaps some parts of European Media Freedom Act might be a bit technical for you, so I will try to focus on the main provisions which are of utmost importance for media environment in any member state and any candidate country. So if we go to the first pillar, which is rights and duties of media service providers, so here the main provision is the one which protects editorial independence of any media service provider. So the overarching principle is that states should not interfere in editorial policies and decisions of media service providers. So this is general principle. And then there is very particular protection given to media and journalists, according to which states they cannot force journalists or media to disclose their sources and confidential communications. Of course, if you read the European Media Freedom Act, you will see that this is the rule, but some exceptions are possible in case important public interests have to be protected, but European Media Freedom Act puts a lot of conditions for such exceptions to be activated, like, for example, judicial authorization of getting access to journalistic sources or communications, proportionality, and in the particular case of deployment of spyware, which is considered as a very serious infringement of media freedom, there are very strict conditions. So in principle, spyware cannot be used against journalists and media almost, I would say, in any event, and only in the case of serious crimes committed by journalists themselves. Authorities could think of using such technical surveillance means as spyware. So it's really very, very exceptional. And there are two other important things in this part of the regulation. One is rules guiding functioning of public service media. So there are principles about how appointments of heads of public service media should be done, and another important rule requiring that member states provide adequate financial resources to public service media so that they are able to fulfill their public service remit. And the last point I wanted to mention from this pillar is that Media Freedom Act is almost entirely about rights for media and benefits for media, and there are just two duties of media service providers specified in the Act. One is transparency, so basically to disclose owners of media, and the other is quite a soft obligation asking media to take appropriate measures, appropriate internal measures to guarantee independence of editorial decisions. So here we're talking about the situations where, for example, the head of the media company might, for business reasons, might want to put some pressure on journalists. So this provision is inviting media service providers to take measures to protect journalists from such situations. So this is also a moment to say that the Media Freedom Act is accompanied by a recommendation on two matters, on these internal safeguards for editorial independence and on media ownership transparency. So this recommendation is already in place, in force, you could say, and can already be used to implement measures to better protect media. Regulatory cooperation, so it's again how national regulators work together to strengthen European media markets, but it's quite a procedural part, so I will not stop for a long time here, and I might come back if you have questions. Then the digital environment. So here I would like to highlight two things. So first of all, of course, as you witness every day, platforms, and in particular very large online platforms, they have become a major channel for media service providers. But at the same time, of course, they have their own terms and conditions. So terms and conditions of a private company then can have quite a significant impact on what media content ultimately reaches viewers and which media content is, for example, blocked or suspended. So the idea of this part of Media Freedom Act is to give additional protection to the content of media service providers. So how it works? On the one hand, media service providers will have to make a declaration to platforms that they are regulated, that they adhere to editorial standards, and so on. And on the other hand, platforms will have to give an extra procedural safeguard to media, which is to give them time to respond to the stated intention to suspend or restrict content. So in other words, if platform plans to suspend or restrict content, it has to warn media and wait for its reply. So that is more or less the procedural safeguard. Of course, you will have, if you look at the Media Freedom Act, you will see many detailed provisions, but in short, that is the idea. And then for the digital environment, there is a consumer right to customize media offering. So here the idea is that if you go to a connected TV interface, you would typically find media applications which are already pre-installed on your device or on your user interface. So the idea of these provisions is to give each European a right to change those default configurations. So they may want to put a different media app in the first place, for example, so that they can immediately access it. So it's kind of a new consumer right for European media users. Then talking about how media markets are regulated, again, two main pillars. So one is about any laws or decrees or measures by national regulators which affect media service providers. And so there are a range of general principles which apply to such measures, such as objectivity, non-discrimination, proportionality. And then, secondly, there are specific rules about assessment of media market concentration. So if a media market concentration could have significant impact on media pluralism, there has to be an assessment of its likely effect on the functioning of the internal market for media services. And if indeed such effect is likely to be tangible, then also the body that I mentioned at the beginning, the board, will have to be involved in the assessment of the impact of media market concentration. So one thing perhaps to mention is that these provisions are, of course, not meant to prevent media market concentrations, but rather to suggest remedies for concentrations which could lead to negative impacts on media pluralism or on the internal market for media services. Suggest why? Because ultimately it's an opinion from the board. So it's not binding, but it is expected that since the body will collect regulators from all the member states, that its opinions will have sufficient weight and will be taken into account in media market concentration assessments at national level. And finally, the pillar on transparent and fair allocation of economic resources. So there is one pretty technical part on audience measurement, so on methodologies for audience measurement. And then the part on state advertising, which more or less requires that state advertising funds have to be distributed objectively, observing proportionality and non-discrimination. And there is a specific duty for public authorities each year to make public how much they spend on advertising, specifying for which media outlets the advertising money was spent. So the expectation is that this way there will be less use of state advertising as a tool to control media, and that this money will be distributed in a fairer way. So this is what I wanted to say by way of introduction on European Media Freedom Act. Once again, it will apply from August 25. And we are already preparing for its application. We will work together with the market, but also with member states to make sure that once this date comes, everyone is ready to start applying European Media Freedom Act. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Perkauskas, for all these informations and details. And now I will give a chance to audience to ask some questions if they want to. Da li imamo neko pitanje iz publike sada? Okay, no questions for now. Maybe later they will they want to. No? Okay. Nisam videla. Okay. No. Okay, there's no question for now. Maybe later will be some time to discuss about all these details. But I just want to ask you to stay with us for a few seconds more, because I want to ask you about the necessity for such a document, since we know that media freedom is one of the principles of European Union. And when we talk about editorial freedom, about protection of journalists and their sources, and all of these things that you mentioned, they all exist actually in acts from respective countries of European Union. So can you tell us something more about necessity for this act?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question, because, of course, you are right that since regulation of media is largely a member state competence, of course, many member states have rules and institutions in place to make sure that media is functioning in an independent way. So that was a little bit our starting point, but I must say the more we were exploring, the more we were realizing that protections and safeguards, they are not necessarily in all member states in all areas. So, for example, a member state might have a general principle of editorial independence, but not necessarily specific provisions on protection of journalistic sources, or perhaps not necessarily specific provisions on state advertising. Perhaps we rely on public procurement, which leaves some gaps in the protection of fair distribution of state advertising. So this is one thing, that the more we were digging, the more we were realizing that we never have 100% of safeguards in all the areas in all member states. And then another thing is that the more we were digging, the more we were realizing that also the way the safeguards are framed differs a lot from one member state to the other. So we thought that it's a very good idea to lift the level of safeguards and to make sure that those safeguards become comparable across the European Union.
And one more question, does this act, you mentioned very large online platforms, and does this act actually regulate social media?
Social media is definitely used also to distribute media content. So when we talk about very large online platforms, we are using the same definition as in the Digital Services Act, and yes, that act also applies to social media. So in short, yes, through this legal technique, the European Media Freedom Act also applies to social media, but of course in this very specific respect of circulation of media content on social platforms.
Can you give us some details about that? In which way?
This is what I was exploring a bit when we were talking about digital environment. So this slide. Let's say what social platforms, social media will have to do is to slightly adjust the way they restrict or suspend content coming from media service providers. So in other words, media service providers, they will let social media know that they are media service providers, not just any user on the platform. And if content comes from such media service provider, platforms will have to apply a couple of extra safeguards for this kind of content, and mainly warning media service provider about the coming removal of the content, and allowing media service provider to express its views, to oppose, let's say, and explain that it's not justified. So this is mainly how Media Freedom Act will apply to social media.
Okay, thank you. I think that it's very important to emphasize this, because they will actually need to react faster on harmful and illegal content if I enforce well.
Yes, and perhaps one thing to underline is that these additional safeguards apply only in case content is suspended and or removed on the basis of terms and conditions of the platform. So in other words, if a platform has to comply with Digital Services Act and remove, for example, illegal content on that basis, on the basis of the law, then nothing changes. Social media just continues functioning under Digital Services Act. So this is really limited to instances where we don't have legal obligations, but still the platforms or social media wants to apply its own terms and conditions.
Thank you very much. I will ask once again the audience if someone has a question. Okay, we have one question from audience.
Thank you. This is called something for freedom of media, right? But we're talking a lot about the moderators in these documents. So what are going to be the standards of these moderators, and who's going to decide about it? It's a large question, I know, but I'm interested into it because it's about freedom, right? So how to connect these two notions together?
Yes, so thank you for your question. If I understand this correctly, it still relates a little bit to platforms, because after all, platforms are moderating content and decide which content should stay or which should go on the basis of their terms and conditions. So in a way, nothing changes. They will continue themselves deciding on that. So this warning, which is given to a media service provider before the removal of content, is a procedural safeguard. So it will still be up to the platform to ultimately, after discussing with the media service provider, to decide whether it removes content or not. Of course, it will be open to media service providers to bring the matter to media regulators or to courts to contest decisions of platforms, but still platforms ultimately decide on the application of their terms and conditions after these procedural safeguards are exhausted. So nothing in a way changes in that respect.
Okay, thank you. No more questions for you, as I see. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Perkauskas, for all these details and informations, and for being with us here today. It was really a pleasure to have you here today in European House here in Belgrade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to join you.
Okay. And now I will give a word to Mr. Julian Ringhoff from Brussels. Okay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, and I can see you, and I can see myself on the screen. That's fantastic. Let me try to share my screen. It should be this one. 1 second.
Okay, while we're waiting, I can tell that Mr. Ringhoff will inform us about, as you see, Digital Service Act.
Yes.
Something that is actually complementary with this Media Freedom Act.
Exactly. Shall I start?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah, we are ready, if you are.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to present the Digital Services Act at the EU Opportunity Week. And I guess there was also already a very good transition to the DSA, the acronym that we're using, because of the interplay with the European Media Freedom Act. And I can actually explain a bit more about this interplay also throughout my presentation. Very quickly, my name is Julian Ringhoff, and I work at DG Connect, so the Director General of the European Commission that is responsible for digital policies, and in particular in the team that enforces the Digital Services Act vis-à-vis the so-called very large online platforms. And then I have a particular role in that team, namely international engagement on the DSA, simply because there's a lot of international interest in the DSA, because it's really arguably a blueprint legislation for many other governments around the world that are, trying to address similar problems online. Okay, so why the DSA? Just very briefly, because I'm sure you know many of the issues that we witness online. On one side, of course, digital services have become more and more important for societies, economy, political processes, whether it's gathering information around elections, reading the news, or finding friends and groups of interest. They're extremely important, but also we have e-commerce platforms where we buy a lot of our goods these days. And this development of the digital world becoming important will only accelerate in the future, and this brings a lot of opportunities and challenges. On one side, we have access to more information than ever before. We have access to more products than ever before. But at the same time, this comes with a challenge that there are malign actors that try to take advantage of this open space by disinforming, by selling illegal products, etc. Also, a lot of these digital services are inherently cross-border. So, some of the biggest platforms that we know are, of course, not just active in the EU or one EU member state, but around the world. And then we also have this particular, challenge in the EU that we do not want to have fragmented rule sets, and a few member states had started to legislate in this space, and that's why there was additional pressure to come up with European or EU legislation in this area. So what is the DSA? So in very short, it aims to create a safe, predictable, and trusted digital space, in particular by protecting the fundamental rights of users and establishing a level playing field for businesses. And I will get into it in a bit more detail in a second, but digital services include online marketplaces, social networks, content sharing platforms, app stores, and many other types of services. Just a very short overview timeline of the DSA. So it entered into force roughly 2 years ago. and it has been now applicable to a first set of so-called very large online platforms for a bit more than a year, which is why now it's also, you know, a good point in time to assess how it has been going, and I will share some of this with you. So, who does the DSA apply to? I will not go into all of the nitty-gritty complexities, but basically it's very important to understand that there are different types of digital services, and depending on the type of service, different rules apply. Basically, at the very top, so to speak, here at the bottom on this picture, you have so-called very large online platforms and search engines, which are platforms and search engines that have more than 45 million users in the EU. They have the most far-reaching obligations under the DSA because of their particular impact and relevance. Then you also have online platforms that don't meet this threshold, so they're smaller than 45 million users, they have fewer obligations. Then you have hosting services, for example, cloud services, web hosting that have even fewer obligations, and then at the very bottom, or in this case on the very top, you have intermediaries, so internet access providers, domain name registries, so more the technical infrastructure of the internet that have even fewer obligations. Again, I will not go into the details because I also think what people generally find the most interesting is the obligations for so-called very large online platforms and search engines, because these are, for example, the social media platforms that we all know, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, or what you know, but also e-commerce platforms like Amazon, AliExpress, etc. And so they, as I said, they have the most stringent obligations. For example, in addition to some of the obligations that you see below, they must provide users with choices for their recommender systems. You may have already, you may have not seen it in Serbia, but if you have been to the EU, you may have seen it, that you can now, of course, Serbia is part of the EU, part of the accession process, sorry. So you see that users have choices in the recommender systems, so you can choose between different types of recommender systems. It can be it can be by time, it can be by other personal preferences, so you don't just have to follow the recommender system that the platform offers as a standard, but you can choose. There's, for example, data access for researchers, because there are a lot of problems that we see on online platforms where we still don't have enough information, basically how these problems manifest. So under the DSA, researchers now have access to internal data that they must first request through a very well thought through process. There's transparency reporting of very large online platforms. So, for example, twice a year, platforms must report to the public how many users they have, how many content moderators they have in each language, etc. Now, just a quick overview of the very large online platforms that we have designated. So, in total, we have 24 now. In addition to some of the most obvious ones that I mentioned, like TikTok, Facebook, etc. For example, there's also Wikipedia, part of it. There are e-commerce platforms like Temu and Shein. There are also so-called adult video content platforms that are also in the scope of the DSA, which a lot of people don't know. And search engines are also part of the DSA. Okay, which risk does the DSA try to address? Maybe this is the most important aspect of the presentation today. So the DSA addresses the issue of the dissemination of illegal content. Whether this is an illegal product that's being sold on an e-commerce platform, or it's incitement to violence, so illegal content on a social media platform. The DSA prescribes procedures on how platforms must deal with this content. it also addresses, and this is very, very important to us, negative effects on fundamental rights. So, for example, when the algorithms of a platform or the content moderation that they implement is systematically having negative effects on fundamental rights, for example, because content is removed that is clearly not illegal and that doesn't pose any risk, then this is, of course, a negative effect on the fundamental right to freedom of expression. And so this is very important because we see a lot of regulatory efforts around the world where regulators sometimes have bad intentions of controlling the online space and, for example, restricting critical voices that raise concerns with the government and basically restrict their right to freedom of expression, claiming that this is regulation to make the online space more safe. And this is something that is really at the core of the DSA, that platforms must always assess whether what they are doing, what they are implementing has negative effects on fundamental rights. And this, by the way, also includes negative effects on media freedom and media pluralism. So if there's a systemic negative effect on media pluralism and media freedom that basically comes from the functioning of the platforms, then this must also be mitigated. And then just a few more examples. So negative effects on civil discourse and electoral processes is also very important because we all are familiar with this issue of disinformation. Disinformation is, of course, it's a very tricky problem because if a regulator or a law was becoming too restrictive in addressing disinformation, then there's always the threat that it has a negative impact on a fundamental right to freedom of expression or information. And you really don't want to be in a situation where one single regulator determines what is disinformation, what is misinformation, and what isn't, and then basically shapes the debate. So that's why the DSA takes a very carefully balanced approach, whereas there's not a single regulator that basically makes decisions on each piece of content, but instead it requires platforms to assess at a systemic level, at a procedural level, whether their systems, their algorithms, their resources has a negative or contributes to the spread, for example, of disinformation, which may then have a negative impact on electoral processes. And I can answer some questions about this later because I know it's not very straightforward. Other key risks that the DSA addresses are negative effects on minors, public health. These are also some very important issues, as there are a lot of discussions around the world of the negative effects of certain social media platforms on the well-being of minors. Now, this is also very, very important to us. As I already said, the DSA is not about having one single regulator with all power to determine what's online and what should be online and what shouldn't. It's rather the opposite. It distributes the power amongst different stakeholder groups. So on one side, platforms have certain responsibilities. On the other side, law enforcement authorities have certain responsibilities when it comes to illegal content. But very important, there's also civil society and citizens that play an important role. For example, under the DSA, the platforms must be very transparent in their content moderation and must be consistent. And for example, when a platform decides to delete a piece of content that was posted by a user, they must inform the user why this item was deleted, and then must also provide the user with a channel to challenge this decision. There's also so-called notice and action mechanisms. So when users in the EU identify a piece of content that is illegal or against the terms and conditions of a platform, users must now have the ability to notify the platform of this, basically just through clicking on this piece of content. And then the platform must take action. Either if the platform determines that it's indeed a legal piece of content, then it should be removed. Or if it's not, then it must inform basically whoever requested this removal or notified the platform of this piece of content what other action was taken and why. Maybe one more important aspect, the so-called trusted flaggers. So under the DSA, the digital services coordinators, which are basically the enforcement coordinators in member states, they can designate so-called trusted flaggers. And a trusted flagger is an organization, civil society organization that has proven that it has expertise in a given area, for example, gender-based violence online, terrorist content online, other illegal content. And then such an organization can be awarded trusted flagger status. And this trusted flagger, when this trusted flagger then issues notifications to platforms that certain pieces of content may violate their terms and conditions or member state law, then these must be treated with the priority by the platforms. So it really gives accredited civil society organizations a big opportunity to contribute to making the online world more safe. Very briefly, the governance structure of the DSA. I can also answer questions on this if this is of interest later, but we have a bit of a novel enforcement structure where normally, with EU regulations, it's member states authorities that enforce the law, with the exception of competition and a few other areas, but normally it's member states that enforce the law. With the DSA, we have a bit of a split of responsibilities, namely that the European Commission is the sole enforcer vis-à-vis very large online platforms and search engines. So TikTok, Google Search, etc. It's the European Commission that's responsible for enforcing it. And this is, amongst other things, due to the size of these platforms, the complexity of these issues, and the required resources and expertise that are needed to address these issues. On the other side, the digital services coordinators, so this is at the national level, they enforce the DSA vis-à-vis all the other services. So everything that is not a very large online platform, because it has fewer user numbers or it's another type of service, it's then the DSC of where this company is established that is responsible. Now, very short overview of the enforcement state of play of the DSA. So DG Connect of the European Commission has hired more than 100 new staff for DSA enforcement. Important to say that in the DSA, it's actually specified that very large online platforms must pay a supervisory fee. So basically, we collect money from the very large online platforms to do the enforcement. So it's money that comes from the platforms to the Commission, through which we can then hire staff to enforce the DSA, which is inspired, for example, by what is done in the banking sector also. We've launched the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency in Sevilla. So this is an agency that has expertise in technical expertise when it comes to algorithms and supports us, with the technical expertise in our enforcement. We've had first set of transparency reports, which I really invite you also to take a look at, because it's basically for the first time that a lot of internal information from platforms is becoming public. For example, you can see how many content moderators platforms have working in each of the EU member states, and many other interesting aspects. And these can just be found online through our webpage. We've received now the second round of risk assessment reports, and I can also explain a bit more on this later if there's interest. Maybe a few other highlights is that we've now sent more than 50 requests for information. So this is an official step where if we have a suspicion that a service is not complying with the DSA, we can legally, on a legal basis, request information to assess whether a platform is complying with the DSA. And then maybe most importantly, we've already opened 8 official investigations. The first one was against X, then TikTok, AliExpress, Facebook, and Instagram, for all kinds of issues, not all the same, of course, but very often related to whether data access mechanism for researchers are in place, whether risks for minors were assessed and mitigated sufficiently, for example, in TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. And yes, and then maybe one more point on this slide. We adopted election guidelines, so because of the European Parliament elections this year, there was a specific need to ensure that platforms do more to ensure the integrity of the elections, and that, for example, systemic disinformation does not undermine these processes. And basically, in these election guidelines, we propose to platforms measures that they can take, should take, to address these risks to the European elections. And on this also I can answer any questions if that's of interest. I leave it at this. I know this was a lot of information and it's a complex law, but that's why we hopefully have 5 to 10 minutes to answer any questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
This was the first step. Thank you. I hope Mr. Ringhoff will be with us for questions.
Yes.
Okay, you're here. Okay. We couldn't see you, that's why I was afraid that you left this meeting. So, is there any question from the audience for Mr. Ringhoff? Okay, we have one question here.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask regarding the trusted flaggers, who decides who will become the trusted flaggers? Is that on the Commission or the coordinator or the European board? I didn't get that part. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So it's the digital services coordinators in the member states. So we already have a few examples. I think Finland and Austria have accredited first organizations trusted flagger status. There's actually a very thorough process for this. First, they must apply, and then this application is being assessed on all kinds of based on all kinds of criteria. But then also regularly, these trusted flagger organizations must submit reports in how they're doing their work, and they're basically, it's not that once you are granted the status, you will just remain a trusted flagger forever, but you need to prove that you're doing your work in line with the DSA. But it's the digital services coordinators that accredit them.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Okay, one more.
Yes, 2 questions, please. One on content moderation. So this applies to very large search engines such as Google. Search engine. Google is using, for instance, AI now, which has, for instance, the effect of summarizing the content of media websites, thus not leaning anymore to media content. So this is the decision of the search engine. Is the DSA relevant here? Or a similar example, is it relevant, for instance, when Twitter or X today or Facebook change the algorithm and thus have a tendency to hide in your search certain type of contents that they would not wish to promote? So that's the first question. And then the second is just to have an explanation of what on earth are the 18 billion statements of reasons that the Commission received. So it's quite surprising, but just out of interest.
Yeah, very good question. So the first one, as you will see if you want to take a look in the election guidelines, for example, AI is covered by, AI, generative AI is covered by the DSA to that extent, when, for example, online platforms or search engines use generative AI instead of, their old means of providing information, then because they are a large online platform and they are distributing content this way, then this is in the scope of the DSA. Of course, we have the AI Act also, and there's an interplay with that, but as long as it pertains to designated very large online platforms and the service that they provide to users. This is addressed by the DSA. What's also being addressed by the DSA is, so on one side, it can be a piece of content that's generated with AI, not by the platforms itself, but that basically is created elsewhere and then posted on the platform. This is also, in scope of the DSA. So these are the two aspects. And then, of course, recommender systems, the algorithms of the platforms are obviously, as I also said earlier, in the scope of the DSA. And very important, when a platform decides to fundamentally change how their systems work, then they must always, in addition to these annual risk assessment and risk mitigation reports that they submit with us, they must do a risk assessment and propose mitigation measures when they launch a new feature. For example, when TikTok, maybe you've seen this, they launched a feature in Spain and France on rewarding users on continuous use of the service, and there was no risk assessment made before, and that's basically why we opened proceedings against TikTok. And then TikTok basically turned around and is now discontinued this feature in the EU. So to answer your question, a platform fundamentally changes their algorithm and their functioning, then they must assess this and also show how they mitigate it. For example, because this change can have a negative effect on freedom of expression or freedom of access to information. And this then, I think you were also hinting a little bit at this, if the change also has a negative effect on the availability of content from media, then this must also be assessed. But basically the way this functions, we receive as the European Commission assessments from the platforms, and then we first determine if the assessment was sufficient or if there were certain aspects left out, and then we look into whether these mitigation measures to mitigate potential risks are sufficient. And now the second question on the statements of reasons database. So this is a very interesting feature, and if you just use a search engine and type in DSA statements of reason database, you will find that there's this new transparency database where under the DSA, digital services providers must now basically submit to this database the content moderation decision that they have made. Of course, they do not submit the actual piece of content itself, but they must submit, for example, information on what action did they take on a piece of content, like did they remove it, did they not promote it in their algorithms and other actions that can be taken. And they must share information on whether it was an automated process to make this decision or whether it was under human supervision. And basically the idea behind it is that it provides researchers with the opportunity to look into how content moderation works on these platforms. And we really think it's a very valuable database to conduct research on content moderation in the EU.
Okay, and at the end I will have I have one more question for you. Okay, we saw in those things that tackle that this act tackle that there are protecting of vulnerable groups. Yes, thank you. Protecting our fundamental rights, but regarding the electoral process, for instance, is there any space to be suspicious if this act actually could influence on electoral process and at the end on electoral results?
You mean if the DSA itself or if what platforms are doing?
Well, actually mixed with algorithms.
Yeah. I mean, so we issued the election guidelines because, of course, the particular importance of elections in democracies. And in these election guidelines, basically the way the election guidelines work is that under the DSA, the Commission has the competency to issue guidelines to platforms on how they address certain risks. And you see a list of the risks here. And we are also considering this for other areas, for example, the protection of minors. And then we propose measures that platforms can take. And this includes, for example, the labeling of AI-generated content, the resources that they must have around elections internally to address any risk to the elections. But it also includes ensuring that their algorithms do not promote content that undermines the integrity of elections. So this is very basically all-encompassing. The systems, technology, but also resources and internal processes of the platforms on a specific risk. We now did this with election guidelines more specifically, but that does not mean that platforms must not also do it for other risks. It's just that on elections, we've now issued very specific guidelines on what platforms should do. And I'm saying should do because while they are not mandatory, these measures for platforms in the guidelines, if they do not implement the measures that we suggest, then they must show that the measures that they are implementing instead are equally effective. So it's really quite a powerful tool to address this risk.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and for all these interesting details. Thank you, Mr. Ringhoff. Bio gospodin Julian Ringhoff, koji nam se javio iz Brisela, iz Generalnog direktorata za komunikacije. Pre njega obratio nam se Audrijus Perkauskas, takođe neko ko se bavi ovom oblašću, odnosno nam je predstavio Zakon o slobodi medija.